Hello, I'm Dr. Charles Larkin. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. Myself and my team were commissioned to do a rapid evidence assessment of reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy and how that would impact upon watercourses and the condition of water systems in Ireland by the Irish Water Fóram. This topic was related exclusively to the treatment of watercourses, watersheds, river basins, and rivers, not on urban water provision in Ireland. And it is focused exclusively on the role of the Common Agricultural Policy and the avenues for Common Agricultural Policy reform and how that will improve water quality in Ireland. So we have a series of recommendations which are made from this rapid evidence report. This rapid evidence report is designed not to be a work of original research, but a synthesis of existing research and to identify gaps that exist at the moment and to identify new avenues for research that need to be undertaken by the Water Fóram or by other members of the research community. At the very core of our findings is this idea that public monies should provide for public goods. And in order to support that idea, which is an idea which is gaining credibility in the European Union and has been enshrined in legislation in the United Kingdom as part of the Agricultural Act 2020, it is the idea that basically public money that is expended as a subsidy to the agricultural sector should be purchasing public goods, and those public goods which are non-rival and non-exclusive, but suffer free rider problems such that they are under-provisioned by the market system, such as biodiversity, such as climate conditions, should be supported by the public purse. And at the moment, our subsidization system, which is a product of common agricultural policy, does not necessarily purchase those public goods with public monies, which comes to the core of the question of what are our subsidies buying? Should they be assessed on the basis of economic efficiency or on a multi-criteria analysis that looks at land usage, at environmental impact and other factors? What are the objectives for our environment and the maintenance of the rural economy? Does our subsidy system actually support those two things adequately? And those are questions that need to be more thoroughly answered. Can we move away from an approach to agriculture and the food supply chain that prioritizes yield or output on the part of farms, which encourages intensification? How do we ensure a constant level of renewable natural capital? So when we look at our agricultural sector at the moment, we largely look at it from the point of view of flows. If you look at it from the point of view of natural capital, we begin to look at it as a matter of stocks and the depreciation of those stocks, which have been extensively depreciated over the past 30 years with limited input to maintain them at their pre-existing level or to improve them. Also, we must have an approach to implementation for the recommendations which are within this report, but also the changes in the Common Agricultural Policy, which are proposed by the European Union, that have the minimum level of disruption for those that are in the farming community, as well as those who are the final consumers, and has the greatest stakeholder involvement and engagement, which is part of what the Water Fóram is there for. And we must ensure that changes to CAP deliver sustainability, food security, and ensure the viability of farms and consumer households. And what is meant by that is that farm gate income needs to be supported in such a way as to make farms sustainable, but also that consumer households, especially those which are vulnerable, are thoroughly supported in the transition such that they are not put in a position of food poverty. And ultimately, that leads us to the original point of the conversation, which is how do we ensure that public monies purchase public goods? The reality is that there is no such thing as cheap food. Food costs money and it incurs significant trade-off costs if you're going to change what is being done. That is not only in the case of the cost of food to the individual, but also to the environment. And it is a complex system, and it is one in which we cannot make Pareto optimal solutions and recommendations in which all are made better off without making one individual worse off. There are clear trade-offs, and this requires consultation, and that will need to be very, very much put into the foreground. It is also important to note that the idea of one size fits all is a problem. The Common Agricultural Policy is slowly moving away from that approach, but it is still far too much of a one size fits all approach for the entirety of the European Union. And even at the national level, with Pillar 2 policies, the approach that has been taken thus far has been inadequately sensitive to local conditions, local soil conditions, local environmental conditions, the types of farming and farmers that are there to ensure that you get the optimal level of environmental improvement, as well as ensure the maintenance of river basins and water courses in Ireland. The other thing, of course, is that there needs to be a lot more original research. If we're moving towards an evidence-based approach or an evidence-informed approach to policy formation and a results-based approach to subsidizing agriculture, not only in Pillar 2, but also in Pillar 1, then we need much more evidence, and we need an awful lot more research on the basis of the evidence that is collected in order to come up with optimal policy and for error correction. As part of this rapid evidence assessment, which is a tool which is commonly used in public health policy, NICE in the UK, the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics uses it, and also the Library and Research Service of the Houses of the Oireachtas uses this quite often as a way of synthesizing the existing research to try to address a single question in one area. And as part of this process, we found a couple of different things that are important to note. One is that there are significant data gaps for Ireland in comparison to the United Kingdom and in comparison to continental Europe. That has been a major impediment in how we can calculate natural capital and has resulted in our doing an awful lot of proxying in that initial calculation. The EPA has commissioned a more thoroughgoing research project with Stephen Kinsella from the University of Limerick and Jane Stout from Trinity College Dublin to try to come up with a more accurate estimation of natural capital, but these data problems are persistent. In certain areas of agriculture, it's largely based on US data, such as in poultry farming. There is some initial Irish work, but that is very recently published. Actual analysis of different areas of Irish agriculture outside of wet and dry stock cattle is limited. The peer review publications in the literature are largely dominated by researchers who are at Teagasc or are related to Teagasc or had spent the majority of their career at Teagasc. And Teagasc has an outsized impact on the research agenda in the agricultural space. It would be beneficial to have a much more diverse ecosystem of research, but of course there are limitations. Some of those limitations relate to the fact that research which is orientated towards the Irish evidence base is very difficult to be published because there's a limited market for that in academia and in a publisher-parish environment that it will not improve anyone's career. So there needs to be some thought put into how to improve the research environment and build up the evidence base for informing policy. Certain areas are very thoroughly researched, such as forestry. And there's a lot of forestry in our final report, and that is because that has been the dominant question that has been asked with respect to environmental schemes in Ireland over the past decade. And it also has a very much commercial bent, which reflects the ideas of culture, which is one of the major sponsors of the research. Antashka has a very limited role in all of this in comparison to their European peers. The Department of Public Expenditure has evaluated the GLASS scheme, but exclusively on a value for money basis. A multi-criteria analysis would probably be more correct given the objectives of the GLASS policy, but thus far many of the Pillar 2 policies have been exclusively seen through this value for money, deeper lens. And further thought needs to be made on that. And while consistent internally to the deeper requirements, it is not necessarily what would be optimal from a point of view of public policy. And farm incomes need to be looked at. Teagasc has already done some initial work on this. It is very clear that farms are no longer exclusively based upon the income of the farmer themselves, but upon the household in general, made up of partners and other family members. So there's a difference between farm income and farm household income that needs to be more thoroughly looked at. And as a small open economy, Ireland, of course, has very limited tools in terms of determining its own policy. So this is the Irish Water Forum's matrix of analysis. The climate and environment relates to air, water, ecosystems, and the soil. We've used this as part of our analytical tools in doing the rapid evidence assessment. On top of that, we need to make a very strong point that food systems are highly complex, and it is almost impossible to decouple the changes in common agricultural policy and environmental policy and the impact on the price of food in shops. And Ireland has a particularly sensitive environment with respect to this because Ireland has one of the highest proportions of non-market income households in the European Union, the second highest after the United Kingdom. If you look at that in the context of food insecurity, Ireland is third highest in the European Union. So Ireland, if it were to implement these changes, needs to take into account that at the moment there will be a lot of households, and this is before COVID, that would be in a very financially precarious situation that could not absorb a 5 to 10% increase in the price of food. And as has been highlighted by COVID repeatedly, the conditions of COVID and the way in which funding in households has been redirected is that the money that used to be spent on food, which could be up to 50% of income in certain cases, has been redirected towards accommodation costs. And as the phrase that the New York Times has used for this is that the rent eats first. And that's something that needs to be taken into account if you are going to impose any changes for environmental purposes on the agricultural sectors to address this issue of non-decoupled environmental changes and household incomes. We also know that the Lancet and the Lancet Eat report has highlighted many of the issues related to food production and environmental effects of that. Obviously, the production of meat-based protein has a very large environmental footprint. It also has a significant health footprint. The Eat Lancet Commission has very much highlighted that the current Western diet is neither good for the planet nor for individuals, and that a much more plant-based diet would be better for both. There are also significant logistics issues attached to that, and food sustainability and security issues. Tim Lang, who is the member of the Lancet Eat Commission, has recently published a book entitled Feeding Britain, which rehearses many of these things in comparative data purposes and highlights the fragility of supply chains between the United Kingdom and Ireland and the rest of the European Union. The Library and Research Service, the Parliamentary Budget Office, the Oireachtas, has produced a very nice overview of the amount of farm income, the amount of subsidies that go into agriculture. Not all agriculture is built the same. It is very, very clear that dairy is the most financially viable area of agriculture. It relies least on subsidies, but it also has quite an impact on the environment in terms of runoff. At the same time, the other areas of agriculture rely very heavily on subsidies. And this creates a bit of a conundrum because you can change the subsidies and change behaviors quite easily in those sectors that rely heavily, but it's much more difficult to do that in areas that rely less heavily on that. In the case of dairy, dairy has been expanded since the end of milk quotas. It has been export orientated. and it doesn't rely as heavily on a cap. So how do you change behaviors there? There are some good examples, such as the Bride Project. The question is, how do you scale that and how do you adapt that to local conditions? And if you look at the moment in terms of the impact of COVID on the agricultural sector, you can see how painful COVID has been for agriculture thus far. It possibly is a beneficial thing because it has probably taken as much air out of the agricultural sector as can be taken when made in direct comparison to to what could happen with a hard Brexit, which is still a distinct possibility. I'm not going to dwell on this much, but these are just some very basic graphs which are presented here for the purposes of highlighting the role of agriculture in exports. And you can see here the proportion of goods exports of agriculture. You can see that overall it's about 7.7% in 2019. It adds up to about 11.7 billion. If you compare that to the exports and services in Ireland over the same period of time, that's 221 billion. Agriculture is there, it is important, it's a significant part of merchandise export, but it is not a significant part of the Irish economy. It employs about 5% of the population, but taking into account all issues with GDP, it barely is getting up to 1% of the economy. So the question really becomes, if you're going to pay this much subsidy, should you not be getting more public goods back for your money? Because it is not a large contributor to the overall Irish economy. That is not to say that it is not a very visible and large contributor to the economy in rural Ireland. Rural Ireland relies quite heavily upon this in terms of employment. But as John Moore, the former Secretary General of the Department of Finance, has very clearly highlighted, Ireland can no longer afford rural Ireland. So there's a wider rural economy question that needs to be addressed. And it is perhaps not necessarily best addressed by the current structures of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 CAP and its implications for biodiversity and climate change. We had a very basic stab at calculating out natural capital. It comes out to 4.4 billion. There's a lot of peculiarities in this, partly due to the fact we don't have a time series of water abstraction data, which is really essential to calculate out natural capital. On top of that, there's a huge amount of energy which is imported into Ireland, which again makes the UK style natural capital figures very difficult to calculate out. But this is just to give you an idea about the stock of natural capital that exists at this moment in time. This whole way of thinking about natural capital, public monies for public goods, is at the core of the UK Agriculture Bill that has now been passed. Not going to say that it's perfect, but it does provide a live natural experiment for the European Union to watch to see whether or not these policies will improve the environmental conditions in the United Kingdom while also maintaining food security. The EU policies are themselves changing. Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy, dramatically reducing the amount of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, antibiotics which can be used in agricultural processes. This will have positive knock-on effects for the water table and water courses. It has some significant impacts on prices and profitability for farms. And that needs to be teased out with all the stakeholders involved, and an understanding again that that food system is exceptionally complex and that there are a lot of things that can be fallen between the cracks in the process of implementation, and that must be very carefully done. And if we're moving towards a results-based system, that those key performance indicators are developed and are robust and are corrected where they are not providing adequate information or incentivizing the wrong types of behaviors. Important to note is the Dasgupta review, recently discussed at the OECD Fóram. We have underinvested in natural capital, even though it has a relatively high rate of return. And you can see here that over time, it has been largely depreciated down over the past 30 years. And you can see how much physical capital has improved, physical buildings and plants and roads and rails and airports, human capital, which is what the universities produce, and the rest. This is not a new idea. This is a report, Living Beyond Our Means, which is part of the European Union discussions going back to 2008. So this is over a decade old in conversation. It's not a new idea. It's just that it hasn't really come to the fore, especially since business as usual has not been the case for the European Union really since 2008. So we have some high-level recommendations, which are here. There's the macro recommendations, reform the direct payments in Pillar 1 CAP, such that they support biodiversity and production equally. So the idea is that Pillar 1 payments will become much more oriented towards a results-based activity, and those results are going to be oriented towards biodiversity and environmental conditions. We need to adopt a more food systems approach to reform, which looks not only at supply chains and policies, but also food consumption habits. It's basically systems thinking. It cannot be siloed thinking. At the national level, is to have more investment in agri-environmental schemes, again, results-based, tailored to environments throughout every level, macro, meso, and micro. Local conditions, local variation, subsidiarity principles should be put in place as often as possible. And there should be an acknowledgement that land usage policies, that the conditions of different farms, that not all land is created equal, and that a lot of sensitivity and local variation is required. At the same time, there needs to be an improvement in skills. There needs to be an upskilling of farmers. There needs to be an improvement in farm advisors. There needs to be a co-production approach. This I see is very much an opportunity for the Institute of Technology sector, the technological university sector, to really have a much more active role in the agricultural sector and in the environmental sector. To make all of this work, to have the real-time data, to have the analysis and evidence base, and to connect up peer networks of learning as well as farm advisors, you need rural broadband. It's the necessary condition to make all this happen. And if you don't have that in place, you're not going to have the ability to do these things. You need alternative market avenues to limit the monopsony power of purchasers, which encourages certain behaviors in production numbers and levels. We need diversity around forestry schemes that are cohesive with agri-environmental schemes. In many cases, they are not, and that needs to be thought about more thoroughly. And while culture has made changes over the years, it is clear that there's still a lot of recalcitrance and bad feeling in the farming community given past practices. So shorter supply chains for environmental policy purposes need to be investigated. Also for the fact that we now, in the conditions of the UK land bridge coming into question, there needs to be a more fulsome thought about the fact that we have a much more longer and weather-dependent supply chain on continental Europe. And then the development of an asset-based approach, as opposed to just looking at it as a profit and loss account. We need to begin to take it into account of asset depreciation, a much more comprehensive approach to accounts that you would have for a going concern, which of course is one of the great flaws in GDP and other macro statistics, is that we look at flows, we don't really look at stocks. And at the farm level, again, the role of farm advisors, peer-to-peer networks, building trust, building dialogue. Again, this is a huge role for the Water Fóram in the future for this. Better enforcement of cross-compliance in combination with better communication about impacts and certain practices and how they impact. A development of key performance indicators that can be studied longitudinally over time and give rise to standards. And these co-produced with authorities, informed by research and developed by leaders in the farming community. This is where we can begin to look at bootstrapping pilot projects such as the Burn project and the Bride project, and try to see if those can be implemented with local variation on a national basis. Burn being that of a environment of extreme natural beauty as well as fragility, and the Bride project, which tries to apply good environmental practices to the dairy industry. And we need more uptake of technology. There's a chicken and egg there with the broadband, but broadband does need to be solved, and needs to be solved quick, smart. And within that, we can also add better procurement policies and feed policies to reduce pollution runoff. So with that, that is the summary of our report. I hope that individuals have the ability to review the document and to come up with some further ideas and questions. And I thank you for your attention.